the whole time. And as you said, it does not excuse it, but I also understand considering the time that she grew up in. I actually I remember when we first watched it, you're like, this is like a nature versus nurture. And I was like, no, this is nurture. After I read all this stuff, I'm like, it is nurture. Like, this is a product of the way she was raised. Like, she chose to murder, just like Joe chose to murder. But it makes sense how like her cognitive brain formation like took place, and like how she never really established strong social bonds because of like the level of isolation that she experienced the entirety of her life. She really never really had a chance.
Well, I mean, we get hints that like she had to have had something before that, like her interaction with her like husband and stuff, like how she met him and stuff. So she had a little bit, and she had hopes. She just kept having hopes that she was going to
Yeah,
get out, and then they were being, tarnished. I think for me, it was just her explaining that she always thought something was wrong with her, and she's always been seeking out these ways to harm things. That
yeah,
felt to me like a nature's a nurture nature thing,
yeah,
just because it's like serial killers, you learn about them all the time. Their parents and the people, the worlds around them were totally normal. They
yeah.
were just messed up. Sometimes,
Occasionally, yeah,
you know.
yeah. I don't know. I'm gonna get into it.
I'm not,
I think I have different
psychologist.
opinions. And this is in no way to excuse. She is a problem. She should not have gone her whole life getting away with murder. But that's also like a product of the patriarchy, not thinking women can be murderers. I
Mhm.
believe, I'm going to look it up real quick, but when did women get the or get charged with murder?
Well, you had like, Mary with the axe. Remember her?
No. What? Yeah, yeah,
Lizzie.
yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
I meant Lizzie Borden.
yeah, 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 yeah,
When was
yeah.
that? 1892. She did.
Yeah. 1892. This film was in 1918, so not too far afterwards.
Yeah.
Uh, so it's super
She
fun.
murdered her. She's very Lizzie Borden-ish, so
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But I'm gonna get into it. Pearl's an entire time, and as I said, it's not to excuse it. She's an entire problem. She needed consequences and never at any point receives them, and that's a problem. And she does monstrous things that are very messed up. She has actively made bad choices, and she is totally needing to be held accountable for those. But I didn't know a lot about 1918, and it was really interesting to figure out like the context of this film. I was like, I am from the 2000s. I don't know. Like, I was born in 1993. I don't know what
Mhm.
any of this is. And like, I learned about the Great Depression in history class, but like, a lot of this, I just like, I knew the plague happened. I knew the war
Mhm.
happened, but like, I don't know anything about rural life. I was raised in city adjacent most of my life. So Pearl is an entire hilarious time filled with murder, the plague, and other antics. It really highlights what it was like to be a woman in the early 1900s and how the plague of 1918, World War I, and social relationships of women living in rural communities all kind of like mesh together in this mess of his time. The
Mhm.
film shows us a woman named Pearl whose only real friends for the majority of her life were farm animals, and Pearl's only real purpose, according to her family, is to live on this farm the rest of her life, take care of her father, and not have dreams or aspirations outside of that. And
Mhm.
what was really fun about watching and researching this episode is that Pearl's living through her own panini press mess of a pandemic at a pivotal point in her life. Like, she is in her adolescence. I found out how young she is, and it's going to upset you, so I'm just letting you know. Like,
Mhm.
listeners, Gabe, I already told, but you guys who are
I'm already
listening,
upset.
you're going to be very upset when you figure out how much of a child this character is, like literally. But what was really relatable up until the brutal murders was like the fact that she's living through this pandemic in a like time of economic disparity and like all this other like stressful stuff that's going on. But I'm basically going to unpack kind of the historical context of Pearl's lived experiences. So Pearl grew up in the early 1900s. The film is centered in the 1918s, just a few years before the Great Depression. In 1918, that is when the influenza pandemic was in full swing. And as of 2018, that was considered the most severe pandemic of recent history. That was until COVID 19 officially won as the most deadly disease in American history. But in 1918, rural communities were especially impacted by the H1N1 illness, saying that 9 in 10 people died from it if you
Oh my
lived in the
gosh.
rural communities because of the lack of exposure to previous influenza strains. So essentially, because they were isolated in being in a rural community, they had significantly less exposure to illness than people in the cities. So people in the cities didn't only died at a rate of like 1 in 8,000 uh, or something like that. It was similar to that. I
Mhm.
have the exact ones, but I don't have them in my brain. It was significantly less in the cities, and 9 in 10 people died
Mhm.
from H1N1 in the rural areas. So the necessity for isolation in rural communities was quite literally life or death. The statistics were even more damning if you were over the age of 30, specifically saying from the Infection Control Today's article in 1918 flu pandemic, mortality in urban and isolated rural areas varied. They say that analyses for isolated communities such as Labrador, Canada, and Alaska, USA, showed that the majority of adults over 30 years, the mortality for all adults over 30 years was very high and up to 90 to 100% mortality
Wow.
rate. So, like, if you were above 30 and lived in a rural location, you were almost guaranteed to die if you got the H1N1. So, like, the mother's hesitation and rage around Pearl traveling into town and doing more than just getting medicine has significantly more context, as like she falls of the 30 and up category that like would die if exposed to
Mhm.
this illness. So in Pearl choosing to like journey outside of that, in her defense, she's a child, um, but like
Yeah.
she is actively putting the parents' lives in jeopardy.
Yeah. This isn't like a case of like Carrie's mom who was just a problem. This lady had like
Yeah,
reason.
she had a reason. She's like didn't have a reason to be like an asshole, but like, she
Yeah.
did have a reason to be like upset that her kid was like going all around town and like interacting with people and like not wanting to wear a mask when 9 in 10 people were dying of this illness.
Mhm.
So the isolation that Pearl experiences in her youth is also a product of the time period as well as the geographical location she grew up in. While the film was filmed in New Zealand, it is staged in Texas, and basically Texas did not have formalized requirements for attendance for public school until 1915.
Mhm.
So this is 1918. You were not required to go to school legally for more than 60 days at a time unless you were born and educated after 1915 in Texas.
Mhm.
It was also like, as a fun fact, they weren't legally required to give people textbooks until 1918.
Wow.
Like the public school system was garbage back then, especially for girls. You were very
Mhm.
significantly likely to not be educated. Um, Especially in the South. So, with that in mind, it's reasonable to assume that Pearl did not get much socialization as a child outside of the farm and her parents. And this impacted her ability to develop connections with her peers that were of her age, as well as likely impacted her social relationships with others. Extended isolation during early adolescence is known to cause depression, anxiety, high stress, and results in 30% more likelihood of developing symptoms of PTSD. So the impact of solitude on early adolescence can also impact their like self-confidence or like insecurities. Make a
Mhm.
lot of sense. And it's also linked to hypervigilance of social threats and a lack of trust towards others. So like someone's saying something to you and you don't believe them. The trust impact of this is highly dependent upon the home life situation, meaning like if the parents don't suck, you're likely going to be okay. You know, like
Mhm.
adolescents who are in positive home situations are likely to maintain resilience in isolation and also like develop some pro-social interactions because they're having like positive interactions with their parents. But in adolescents living in toxic or abusive situations, which includes emotional and like an emotional neglect on the part of her mother, will experience more mental trauma. So, in comparing this to Pearl's upbringing and the coldness of her mother towards her, it's likely that Pearl fell into like the later category. Um, and I think it is actually very likely that she was not socialized much in school, and that the majority of her socialization was like if she had to go into town or if like she was at church, if they were like religious, which it did seem to suggest that that was possible,
Mhm.
as well as like in that time period, you had to marry your children if you wanted them to be have any sort of financial reward for you. And considering the fact that the mom had no means to like gain financial security because of the situation happening with her husband and the fact that women like weren't allowed to own property without their husbands say so, um, it makes sense that she would try to marry her daughter off to a more affluent family so that she would not have to be financially responsible for her, in addition to like the situation that they're already dealing with caring for the dad. um, I found out there was like research that was conducted on rats, which I like hate animal research, but it's like is what it is. That's what the article that I found was talking about. And they specifically conducted research on rats who experience social isolation, and comparing like that to like human social isolation. And I found out that it was heavily impactful when there was an absence of maternal care. Uh, it combined with isolation, that had significantly more damaging effects beyond just like regular cortisol release and stress. And that social isolation deprived crucial stimuli to the maintenance of neurobiological mechanisms and development within like a growing brain. So, in an article in the National Library for Medicine titled The Effects of Social Deprivation on Adolescent Development and Mental Health, they outline that chronically isolated adolescent rats, isolated throughout their whole adolescent period, have shown abnormal behaviors such as hyperreactivity to stressful situations and increased aggression. Isolation induced changes additionally occur for cognitive processes, such as learning and attention, and result in diminished performance on tasks that involve these processes. Particularly, isolation during adolescence results in cognitive flexibility deficits and impair reward learning, reversal learning, and attention shifting. With this research in mind, over Pearl's like over the top reactions to conflict have a lot more context. Specifically, her rage over feelings of abandonment or rejection tend to make a little bit more sense. And a lot of the other stuff I read too, it was a lot of it was oriented around like the development of social relationships in adolescence and how like the impact of anxiety disorders and depression and other things that were caused by isolation impacted like this feeling of like insecurity and not being able to like feel safe or like feeling like something's wrong with you because you're not developing these connections with people that are of your age. You're not in adolescence. It's so important to have like approval from your peers. So if you're not given the opportunity to interact with peers much at all, you're not going to have that kind of like approval from them. So your establishment of right and wrong is not going to be
Mhm.
socially influenced outside of like what your parents tell you. Um, the context of her marriage as a pathway to escape from social isolation, as well as a pathway to higher economic status, also makes sense for the time period. Marriage was like literally the only method women had to escape toxic family situations, as well as the only method to move up financially from a class standpoint. So, especially considering that like Pearl's family did not have a lot fiscally going on to offer, the fact she was able to marry into a wealthier like family is actually kind of
Mhm.
surprising. um I like it just doesn't make sense really like how she would get in with the rich people considering that like her family didn't really go places within the town and it didn't seem like they were like well connected and they were really rude to the rich people too. So it's like I really just don't even understand how she met Howard,
I think
outside of
she
like they sought out a suitor for her, uh and
I
were
th
lucky.
I think they met in town. I think, like, when
Okay.
she would go in town, he was there. I think that's what she said.
Okay, I
But
don't remember, but yeah, that makes sense then.
Howard's also the kind of person, like, what he wants, he gets. So,
Hmm.
if he saw her and wanted her because of what she would have stood for, which is an obedient wife,
Yeah.
then you get it.
Yeah, and when you find out how old she is, it's really upsetting. So the average age of marriage in 1918 was 20 years old for women, but in the South, it was oftentimes possible to marry younger. In fact, that was like probably more often the case. Like the age of consent was not raised to 16 until 1918.
Yeah.
Uh,
One
the
less mouth to
timeline
feed.
Yeah, and the timeline we're given in the film positions us in 1918 with Pearl married since her husband went to war. As World War I started in 1914, it's possible at this point in the film, Pearl had already been married for 4 years. According to a Google search, X takes place in 1979, and Pearl is roughly 16 in the movie
Mhm.
Pearl. It can be inferred that her character is around 77 years old in X. So if she's 16 in the film, then it can be presumed that she married Howard at the ripe age of 12.
Oh my gosh.
Between 12 and 14 at minimum 12, maximum 14. And then he was sent to war. Her erratic behavior and lack of understanding of the permanence of her actions makes a lot more sense when understanding that she is a literal child. The frontal lobe of the human brain that controls decision making, impulse control, emotional response, and consequential thinking making are not fully formed until a human's in their early to mid 20s. Add the level of developmental trauma and neglect that Pearl has experienced in her early life, it is not shocking that she struggles to understand and unpack the impact of her actions. It is not shocking at all that she would not realize that on her knee jerk reactions that like murder's permanent.
That it has consequences. Yeah.
She does not have the cognitive processing in place. She does not have the frontal lobe in place, even like reconcile that like
Mhm.
her actions have finite and permanent reactions and like consequences. And like add in the fact that when Howard gets home, he's just, you know, that in the future, he just sticks by her. There's no consequences at all. He's just like, all right, well, marriage, we don't get divorced in 1918. And there's a reason, like, I married a 12-year-old
Yeah.
and then went away for a bunch of years. What was I trying to expect? You know, like, I
Mhm.
left her here to
Yeah.
exist. And yeah, so like a lot of the stuff that I ended up reading makes me very worried about Panini Press children. And that like there is a lot of social isolation that happens, especially if you live in a rural community that's already exponentially more isolated than elsewhere.
Mhm.
So as I said, it's not to excuse her actions at all.
Mhm.
But it makes a lot of sense. And as much as she very much is a villain, I do feel bad for the fact that like this was the hand that she was dealt.
Mhm.
She
Yeah,
was
and
really
it's
not given much opportunity for growth. Uh,
no, and there's like there's even more than that too, right? Like she's young, she's married young, there's a pandemic, but she's also the child of immigrants, so there's the
yeah,
pressure to perform and be the perfect American. She's not allowed to talk about like what's happening, like and to be it. Her parents are German immigrants during
World War One.
1918, and
Yeah,
so she has that also to be stressed about, right? Is like that identity, and that stress of her parents and them having to like quiet that part of their history, and
yeah,
perform as upright citizens, especially now, so that no one's like pointing fingers at them. So of course they're going to marry away their daughter like immediately, and also
yeah,
the added pressure of having to take care of her father, like being a caretaker for family, and like all the things that are put onto her is really stressful. And like there needs to be, even now it's a fight to have like compassion and understanding to like the mental effect on people who have to take care of each other and take care of your family. Back then there was
yeah,
none of that. Like her mom just expects her to do everything,
yeah,
and like not uh understand that she also needs her life too. Like her life cannot be just this, and that's
yeah.
what she's fighting for the entire time.
Yeah, and she's also like parentified in that way too. Like she's not really given the opportunity to be a kid. She's married off at 12, expected to eventually immediately become a wife. You are an adult. You don't get to
Hmm.
be a kid. And she really never got to like experience childhood at all. And
Mm-mm.
with that, never got to like establish strong like friendships or relationships outside of like the farm animals that live on her farm. So like it makes sense to me that
Hmm.
she's struggling and that she is like really lonely and isolated and that she is one thing that they really outline especially in adolescence is like that feeling of isolation and loneliness. There's this because of the PTSD and anxiety and depression that ends up being activated with that is that like the desperation to get out of that situation feels like life or death for
Hmm.
them. Like her sobbing, as you said, like it was the loss of her, like her only way out, and she is
Hmm.
sobbing as if she has just witnessed her person be murdered in front of
Yeah.
her. And it's like because it was like that was her only cling to sanity because it was this hope for a future that now like can exist.
Mhm.
And the
Yeah.
like in terms of like how that impacts the brain and like not remembering her actions and having all of these like really intense and like violent outbursts, it's like not shocking that
Mhm.
she ended up this way. And it's also like you mentioned the fact that her husband went to, like in terms of like they are German, her husband volunteered to go fight in the war against
Mhm.
Germany. They are married. There has to be some stress related there too.
Yeah, like, how does
Um,
he feel about her and her family? And, like,
mhm,
also her mom, like, there's also this, like, the classism too, because like, her mom has all that pride as well, like, when they come in Howard's mom brings them the pig to, like as just, like, to take care of him, and they're like, "Oh, you're, so isolated. Your family, though, we need to take care of you," and the mother to just be like, "No, we don't accept that." Like, that's definitely, like, immigrant like thinking too, and then
mhm.
like the pride of that time period, like coupled with the fact that they are in the lower class, like working class, like all of that stress, like like Pearl isn't even allowed to be thankful for things when she gets them because she
Yeah.
isn't allowed to think that she deserves them.
So yeah, like even just thinking like the fact that Mitzi says to Pearl, she's like, "Hey, he could have avoided the war. Like we had the
Hmm.
means to get him out of it, and he chose like the audacity. Like
Yeah,
only he, like only this white man would have the ability to draft dodge financially and then choose not
to
to."
do it, yeah.
Yeah,
And then he's, like, coming back and he's seen, like, especially the First World War, like, he's seen some things, like, he is
yeah,
so like, that's and so that kinda puts into context why he allows her to do what she does in X and, like, why they got as far as they did was he's seen some stuff. Like, he's got his own traumas that he's working through, then he comes home to this, and it's just like,
yeah.
"Okay."
And we were not in the age of therapy. No one talked about anything
No.
ever. If you were crazy, you were just crazy. No one ever, unless you were one, then you could be institutionalized. That was fairly common for
Yeah, and then
adolescents in the early 1900s.
they would, like,
Um,
electroshock you
yeah,
or
electroshock therapy or
lobotomize you.
lobotomize. Yeah. So like, I
Lock you in
guess
a room with
in
wallpaper.
in his own way, maybe it was a kindness in that he didn't get her lobotomized. That's good. But also, as a result of this situation, she never has any consequences for her actions. And also, like, her whole thing is she was like, he was my way out. And then he said he wanted to live on the farm. Like,
Mhm.
there's a whole other discussion about how rich people will like glorify
Romanticize.
poverty, yeah,
Yeah.
romanticize poverty, and like
I'm
be
gonna be
like,
a
oh,
good American
I just
boy.
want to experience it for funsies, and then if I don't like it, I can go back to my mansion.
Yeah.
It's like, like the entire thing. And also it's like, it's at one point, do they ever address the fact that she's murdered his sister? It's like a lot. It's a lot to unpack at the end of the day, is all I
Yeah.
got to say
It
about that.
super is. And I think, there's, some people are like, wow, this is a ridiculous film. There's some just like dislike for it. And I totally get it because it is really weird. Like, and
Yeah,
it
it's quirky.
meanders a lot too. Like there's a lot of just like, what are we doing here? And we're just kind of dwelling along. But really just like watching Mia Goth makes it worth it.
Yeah,
Because like every time she's on the screen, it's just like she's so perplexing, and you really believe her as Pearl,
yeah,
and you do sympathize with her, even knowing what she's doing, what she's going to do,
yeah,
and because now you know what her whole life was
yeah.
when we get to X, like what she sees, she sees Brittany Snow's character, she just sees Mitzi. She
Yeah,
sees
that makes a lot
somebody
more
else,
sense.
she sees Maxine, she sees herself. That was supposed
Yeah,
to be me.
yeah.
Um, Totally get
And
it.
you're
So
living the life that was stolen from me or
yeah,
whatever.
that I deserved. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a whole time. The entitlement feels appropriate for the demographic that she represents. It's okay. It is what it is. She's still a problem. She's
Yeah.
still needed to be stopped.